Imagine you are standing on a coastline that almost no one in the Western world could find on a map. The year is 1624. The air smells of salt and tropical rain. Somewhere behind you, a dense forest stretches into mountains so steep they seem to scrape the sky. And in the harbor in front of you, a fleet of Dutch ships is dropping anchor, not to explore, not to trade in peace, but to build a fortress, to claim something, to stay. Here is the question that should stop you cold. If China claims Taiwan today as an inseparable part of its territory, a province that has simply strayed, then why, when the Dutch arrived in 1624, was there almost no Chinese administration on the island at all? Why did the Spanish rush to build their own fort just 2 years later on the opposite coast? And why, when a Chinese military commander finally did take the island in 1662, did he do so not to reunite it with China, but to use it as a base against China? The story of Taiwan before the modern era is one of the most overlooked, most complex, and most consequential colonial histories in all of Asia. It involves indigenous peoples who had lived on the island for thousands of years before any outsider arrived. It involves Dutch merchants who turned a quiet island into a profitable colony. It involves Spanish priests and soldiers racing to keep up. It involves a pirate empire that operated in the grey space between nations. And it involves a Ming loyalist commander who became, depending on who you ask, either a hero or a warlord. To understand why Taiwan is contested today, you first have to understand what Taiwan actually was before anyone decided to contest it. So let us go back, much further back than 1624. The island we now call Taiwan sits roughly 160 kilometers off the southeastern coast of the Chinese mainland, separated by the Taiwan Strait. In geological terms, it is a young and dramatic island, a spine of high mountains running north to south, with fertile plains on the western coast and steep cliffs dropping into the Pacific on the east. The mountains are genuinely extreme. Yushan, the island's highest peak, rises to nearly 3,952 meters, taller than any mountain in Japan, taller than anything in Western Europe outside the Alps. Those mountains mattered enormously. They were not just scenery. They were a barrier that shaped the entire history of the island. Because the people who lived in those mountains, the indigenous Austronesian peoples of Taiwan, were not passive figures waiting to be discovered. They had been there for an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 years, possibly longer. Linguistic and genetic research now strongly suggests that Taiwan was the original homeland from which the entire Austronesian language family spread, meaning the ancestors of people now living across a vast arc from Madagascar to Hawaii to New Zealand likely trace their origins to this island. That is one of the genuine wow facts of world prehistory, and it is almost never mentioned in discussions about Taiwan's political status. These indigenous peoples, and it is important to use the plural, because there were and are many distinct groups speaking different languages with different customs, had complex societies, trade networks, and territorial boundaries of their own. They were not a single unified nation, but they were not a blank slate either. Now, here is the myth that needs to be addressed early, because it shapes almost every modern political argument about Taiwan. The idea that Taiwan was historically a natural and obvious part of China, that Chinese civilization simply extended there as it extended everywhere else in the region. The historical record does not support this cleanly. Chinese fishermen and occasional settlers had certainly visited and even lived on parts of Taiwan's western coast for centuries before European contact. The Penghu Islands, a small archipelago between Taiwan and the mainland, had a Chinese administrative presence from around the 13th century under the Yuan dynasty, but Taiwan itself, the main island, was not formally administered by any Chinese dynasty until 1683. Before that, Chinese imperial governments largely regarded the island as beyond their jurisdiction. Some official documents from the Ming dynasty period describe it as a place of savage peoples outside the realm. That is not the language of a government that considers a territory its own. This matters not to score political points, but to understand what was actually happening when the Europeans arrived. By the early 17th century, the waters around Taiwan were already busy. Chinese traders, Japanese merchants, and a growing number of European ships were all circling the island and the broader region. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials VOC, one of the most powerful commercial organizations in history, had been trying to establish a trading base near China for years. They had tried Macau, but the Portuguese were already there. They had tried the Penghu Islands, but the Ming dynasty pushed them out after a standoff. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The Ming officials essentially told the Dutch to go settle on Taiwan instead, which was, from the Ming perspective, outside their territory. This is a fact that historians of Taiwan find deeply significant. China's own representatives, at the moment of European arrival, pointed to Taiwan and said, "That is not ours." The Dutch accepted the offer. In 1624, they established Fort Zeelandia on a small sandbar peninsula on Taiwan's southwestern coast, near what is now the city of Tainan. It was a modest beginning, a collection of wooden structures that would eventually grow into a proper stone fortress. But it was the seed of something much larger. Within a few years, the Dutch had set up what was effectively a colonial government. They called the island Formosa, a name derived from the Portuguese Ilha Formosa, meaning beautiful island, which Portuguese sailors had reportedly used when they first glimpsed the coastline decades earlier. The Dutch were not interested in Taiwan for its scenery. They were interested in it as a trading hub, a place where goods from China, Japan, and Southeast Asia could be collected, taxed, and shipped onward to Europe and beyond. To make the colony profitable, they needed labor and they needed land under cultivation. This is where the history becomes uncomfortable, because the Dutch actively recruited Han Chinese immigrants from the Fujian region of the mainland to come and farm the island's western plains. These migrants, often called Hoklo or Minnan people, came in significant numbers. They brought rice cultivation, sugar production, and deer hunting on an industrial scale. Taiwanese deer hides became a major export commodity, shipped in enormous quantities to Japan, where they were used for samurai armor and leather goods. At the peak of the trade, hundreds of thousands of deer hides were being exported annually. The deer population of Taiwan's western plains was effectively devastated within a generation. The Dutch also engaged directly with the indigenous peoples, with results that ranged from cautious cooperation to outright violence. They established a system of village alliances, conducted population surveys, and sent missionaries who created the first written scripts for several indigenous languages, using the Latin alphabet. These texts, known as Sincan manuscripts, are among the most remarkable documents of the colonial era. Legal contracts, land deeds, and religious texts written in indigenous languages by indigenous hands, using an alphabet introduced by Dutch missionaries. Some of these documents survived for centuries and were still being used by indigenous communities to assert land rights long after the Dutch had gone. Meanwhile, on the northern coast of the island, a parallel colonial drama was unfolding. In 1626, just 2 years after the Dutch landed in the south, Spanish forces sailed from Manila and established a fort at the northern tip of Taiwan, in what is now the Keelung area. They called it Santiago. A second fort was built further south along the northern coast. The Spanish motivation was partly commercial and partly strategic. They were worried about Dutch dominance in the region, and they wanted a base from which to trade with China and Japan and to send missionaries into the interior. The Spanish colonial presence in northern Taiwan lasted about 16 years. It was never as economically successful as the Dutch colony in the south. Trade with Japan was difficult because Japan had by this point largely closed itself to Spanish and Portuguese contact, suspicious of the link between Catholic missionaries and European political ambitions. The missions into the indigenous interior produced some remarkable linguistic records but limited conversions. And the Spanish were chronically short of resources because Manila kept prioritizing other concerns. In 1642, the Dutch moved against the Spanish forts in the north. After a short siege, the Spanish garrison surrendered. The Dutch now controlled the entire island, or at least the coastal and lowland portions of it. The mountains remained, as they always had, beyond effective colonial control. The Dutch period lasted until 1662. In those roughly 4 decades, Taiwan was transformed. The Han Chinese population grew substantially. Agriculture expanded. The VOC extracted considerable profit. And then, almost without warning, the entire structure collapsed, not because of another European power, but because of a man named Zheng Chenggong. Zheng Chenggong is one of the most fascinating figures in the history of East Asia, and he is almost unknown in the Western world. His father was a Chinese maritime merchant and sometime pirate who had built a commercial empire operating across the South China Sea. His mother was Japanese. He was born in Japan in 1624, the same year the Dutch landed in Taiwan, and raised partly in China. He received a Confucian education, was given a prestigious name by the last Ming emperor, and became the most determined military commander still fighting for the Ming dynasty after the Qing, the Manchu dynasty from the north, had conquered most of China. By the late 1650s, Zheng Chenggong had lost his mainland base. The Qing had pushed him back. He needed somewhere to regroup, somewhere to sustain his forces and continue the fight to restore the Ming dynasty. Taiwan, still held by the Dutch, was the obvious answer. In 1661, he sailed across the strait with a fleet that some sources describe as numbering in the hundreds of ships and carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. The Dutch were caught largely off guard. Fort Zeelandia was besieged for 9 months. A remarkably long resistance for a garrison that was never going to receive reinforcements. The VOC sent a relief fleet, but it was not enough. In February 1662, the Dutch governor signed the Articles of Surrender and the Dutch withdrew. The VOC's Formosa colony, nearly 4 decades of construction, trade and missionary work, was over. Here is the crucial historical point that often gets lost in nationalist retellings of this story. Zheng Chenggong did not take Taiwan to give it to China. He took it to use it as a base against the Qing dynasty, which he considered an illegitimate foreign conquest of China. In his framework, he was the defender of the true Chinese order, fighting against the rulers who now controlled the mainland. Taiwan was his fortress, his supply base, his refuge. He died just months after the conquest, in June 1662, possibly of illness, possibly of exhaustion. He was 37 years old. His son and then his grandson continued to rule Taiwan as a semi-independent Ming loyalist state for another 2 decades. They maintained the fiction that the Ming dynasty would be restored. They traded, they fought occasional naval skirmishes with the Qing, and they governed the island. But the cause was slowly dying. The mainland was firmly under Qing control. The Ming restoration was not coming. In 1683, a Qing naval force under the command of Admiral Shi Lang, who had once served under Zheng Chenggong before defecting, defeated the Zheng fleet in a battle near the Penghu Islands. The Zheng regime on Taiwan surrendered. And now, for the first time in its history, Taiwan came under the formal administration of a Chinese imperial dynasty. But even this moment requires careful interpretation. There was a debate within the Qing court about what to do with Taiwan. Some officials argued it was a remote, difficult island with no great strategic value, and that the population should simply be evacuated to the mainland. Shi Lang himself argued strongly for keeping it, warning that if the Qing abandoned it, some other power would eventually take it. He won the argument. Taiwan was incorporated into Fujian province as a prefecture. For the next 2 centuries, Taiwan was administered by the Qing, but it was not a peaceful or settled administration. The island was frontier territory. The Qing imposed restrictions on immigration from the mainland for much of this period, though the restrictions were often ignored or circumvented. The Han Chinese population continued to grow, pushing further into indigenous territories. There were repeated uprisings against Qing authority between different groups of Han settlers and between Han settlers and indigenous communities. A Qing official of the period reportedly said that Taiwan experienced a major uprising every 5 years and a minor one every 3. The island was profitable but ungovernable. It was not until 1885, less than a decade before Japan would take it, that the Qing elevated Taiwan to the status of a full province, its own administrative unit separate from Fujian. The man who pushed for this elevation, Liu Mingchuan, became Taiwan's first provincial governor and began a remarkable program of modernization, railways, telegraph lines, modern schools, industrial investment. By the standards of the Qing Empire in the 1880s, Taiwan was becoming one of its more progressive territories. And then came 1894 and the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan had been watching Taiwan for years. Japanese strategic thinkers understood the island's value as a base for projecting power into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. When the Qing dynasty was defeated by Japan in 1895, the Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan and the Penghu Islands to Japan in perpetuity. The transfer was supposed to be straightforward. It was not. A group of Qing officials and local elites on Taiwan, facing abandonment by the dynasty, made a desperate and historically remarkable decision. They declared the Taiwan Republic, one of the first republics in Asian history, proclaimed in May 1895. It lasted approximately 5 months before Japanese forces completed their military takeover of the island. The Republic was less a genuine democratic experiment than a last-ditch attempt to generate international sympathy and perhaps intervention. It failed on both counts, but it existed, and its existence is one of those details that complicates every simple narrative about Taiwan's past. Japan's colonial period, which lasted from 1895 to 1945, was 50 years of profound transformation. It was also 50 years of colonial rule that involved significant repression, forced assimilation, and the suppression of both Han Chinese and indigenous cultural identity. Both things are true simultaneously, and the historical record requires holding both. The Japanese colonial government invested heavily in Taiwan's infrastructure. They built roads, railways, ports, hospitals, and schools on a scale that genuinely transformed the island. They conducted systematic land surveys, established property rights, and modernized agriculture. Taiwan became one of the most economically productive territories in the Japanese Empire, a major supplier of sugar and rice. Public health campaigns dramatically reduced mortality from diseases like malaria. Literacy rates rose substantially over the colonial period. At the same time, the Japanese administration pursued aggressive assimilation policies, particularly in the later decades. Taiwanese people were pressured to adopt Japanese names, speak Japanese, and identify as Japanese subjects. Indigenous peoples faced particularly intense pressure, and there were periods of violent military suppression of indigenous resistance, most notably the Wuxi Incident of 1930, when the Sedig people launched an armed uprising against Japanese authority. The Japanese response was overwhelming and brutal. The incident is remembered in Taiwan today as a symbol of indigenous resistance, and it was the subject of a major Taiwanese film in 2011. By the 1930s, as Japan moved toward war, Taiwanese men were being conscripted into the Japanese military. Tens of thousands of Taiwanese served in the Japanese armed forces during the Second World War. Some served in Southeast Asia, some in the Pacific. Their experience after 1945 was deeply strange. They had fought for Japan, and then Japan lost, and suddenly they were expected to be Chinese again, subjects of the Republic of China, which arrived from the mainland in 1945 to take control of the island. The transition was catastrophic. The nationalist Chinese administration that took over Taiwan in 1945 was corrupt, chaotic, and deeply dismissive of the local Taiwanese population. Within 2 years, tensions exploded into the February 28 incident of 1947, a popular uprising triggered by a confrontation between nationalist authorities and Taiwanese civilians. The nationalist government's response was a wave of violent suppression that killed an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 people, with estimates varying considerably among historians. The exact figures remain disputed and were suppressed for decades under martial law. The February 28 incident, known in Taiwan as Air Bar, left a wound in Taiwanese society that shaped the island's politics for generations. Then came 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party defeated the nationalists in the civil war on the mainland. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan with roughly 2 million soldiers, officials, and civilians. The People's Republic of China was proclaimed on the mainland, and Taiwan became what it remains today, a separately governed territory whose political status is one of the most sensitive and unresolved questions in international relations. But here is what the full history reveals that the modern political argument tends to obscure. Taiwan's identity was not simply handed to it in 1949. It was built across millennia of indigenous civilization, shaped by decades of Dutch and Spanish colonial administration, transformed by the Zheng family's Ming loyalist state, governed for 2 centuries under the Qing, modernized under Japanese colonial rule, and then scarred by the violent transition of 1945 to 1949. Every one of those layers left something behind. In the language people speak, the food they eat, the architecture of their cities, the stories they tell about themselves. The Austronesian languages of Taiwan's indigenous peoples are still spoken, though many are endangered. Dutch-era documents written in indigenous scripts survive in archives. The name Formosa, given by Portuguese sailors, was used internationally for centuries and still appears in the names of some Taiwanese institutions. Zheng Chenggong, known in Taiwan as Koxinga, is venerated as a founding figure. Japanese-era buildings stand in Taipei, alongside temples built by Fujian immigrants in the 17th and 18th centuries. And February 28th is now a national memorial day, a public reckoning with a history that was once forbidden to discuss. What this history tells us is something that goes far beyond the Taiwan question specifically. It tells us that identity is not a simple inheritance. It is not handed down unchanged from one generation to the next like a sealed box. It is built, contested, layered, and rebuilt. The people of Taiwan did not choose most of the forces that shaped them. They did not choose Dutch colonialism or Japanese rule or the arrival of 2 million mainland refugees in 1949. But they lived through all of it, and all of it became part of who they are. The island that Dutch merchants once called Formosa, Beautiful Island, has earned that name in a way those merchants never intended. Not because of its scenery, though the scenery is extraordinary, but because its history is one of the most complex, most layered, and most genuinely remarkable in all of Asia. And it deserves to be understood in its full complexity, not reduced to a single claim, a single date, or a single narrative. The next time you hear someone speak about Taiwan as if its status is simple, as if the answer is obvious, as if history clearly points in one direction, remember the Dutch fortress on the sandbar. Remember the Spanish priests in the north. Remember the indigenous peoples whose ancestors may have populated half the Pacific. Remember Zheng Chenggong, the Ming loyalist who took the island not to give it to China, but to fight China's new rulers. Remember the Japanese railways and the February 28 massacre, and the 2 million people who arrived in 1949 with a government that claimed to represent all of China. History is rarely simple, Taiwan's history least of all. If this story made you see Taiwan differently, or if it raised questions you had never thought to ask, leave a comment below. What surprised you most? Was it the Dutch colonial period, the indigenous origins of the Austronesian world, or the way the Zheng family's story cuts against the modern political narrative? I would genuinely like to know what landed. Subscribe if you believe history is worth understanding in its full depth, without shortcuts and without myths. There are more stories like this one waiting. And in the next video, we are going to look at another island whose colonial history reshaped an entire region, and whose modern identity is just as layered, just as contested, and just as misunderstood as Taiwan's. You will not want to miss it.